So we got a Patreon listener question. This is a listener question from Billy Brigman. He's one of our Patreon subscribers. Once again, if you're interested in being a Patreon member, just check the description below. We have a whole bunch of different categories that you could be a part of, starting as low as $1. But if you want to ask a question on the podcast, it is the $5 tier, and you'll get a whole bunch of cool stuff too. And then join us on the Discord and have a lot of fun with a whole bunch of other Transformer fans. There's at least at this point, I think 4 dozen or so that are just laughing it up and having a good time. But let's get to Billy's question. Good old Billy B wants to know, I can't help but wonder if when all us kids from the 80s and 90s start hitting the nursing homes, if the franchise will take a hit, obviously Transformers, because of all the other interests that exist currently, such as video games, etc. On the other hand, I didn't really get into the Bay movies, and I'm not sure what generation the legacy lives and how different their reactions are to it. And then he goes on to talk about how his children didn't even really gravitate towards it. So what is my take on that? Now, you know what's funny about that? I've had this discussion many times, not just in relation to Transformers, but toys in general, doing a lot of conventions. And I've said this many times, like when you go to TFCon, especially when you're someone who's there when it's set up, like an organizer or a dealer or a staff, when you're at TFCon and you're just standing there and the room's empty, and you notice that 99.9% of the people are just adults. And the kids, and of course the dealers, they have children, but the children are completely disinterested in this entire room of toys. Now, to me, I've always felt that, like the question he asks here, when we're going to start hitting nursing homes, will the franchise take a hit? 200%. And I'll tell you why, because I already see it from the past generations of different kinds. I use the term the evolution of toy and entertainment, which is, my father is a die-cast car collector. He's almost hitting his late 60s into 70s. Now, the people who used to collect die-cast cars, especially his time frame of the Dinky and the Corgi from the 60s and the 50s, those guys are getting older. And as they're getting older, that demand for that product shrinks and shrinks to the point that the only conventions, and Montreal is a big city, so, if there was conventions, we'd have them. And there is conventions for die-cast, but they pale in comparison in frequency and size to than that of the modern pop culture stuff that exists today of toys. So why? Because that audience is shrinking, and it's shrinking so much that I remember I once went to one of those shows with my father where we were selling, and one of the old guys came up to me and be like, "Oh, you're a new face here." And I was under that implication, wow, it must be so small that even if you're a new dealer, right away you're like, it's like a new person, like in the family, because it must be so small, that community. So it shrinks heavily. But that has to do with the evolution of play. Yeah, Hot Wheels still exist in Toys R Us and Walmart and everything like that and Target, but it's considerably smaller than, let's say, all the action figures that are there, because the interest in die-cast cars shrink. There's also a lot of other factors that lead to the lack of interest in die-cast cars specifically, but it's the evolution of play in general, which is, I'm pretty sure, my grandfather looked at my father and went, "Oh, why isn't he going fishing?"
Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, we used to go fishing and play stickball, And then his generation is buying die-cast cars and all these...
Or model train sets, I think, was another thing
model
that was
train,
pretty big, too.
And pretty much manufactured toys, as opposed to my grandfather's era that wasn't manufactured toys, at least in a more broader sense.
Like, I think somebody else I can think about that collects model trains and builds whole sets and stuff like that is, what's his name? Rod Stewart, apparently. He's really, really, really big into that.
Well, there you go.
And he doesn't do any interviews dealing with music, but if you talk to him about his model train set, he's gonna go in with you.
and that's an individual that's, again, like my father's demographic and age group, where those guys were into that. And then you jump to our generation, and now you went from the fishing practical kind of stuff to my father's generation of manufactured toys and mass production based on cars, trains, real life kind of stuff, to our generation, which is the pop culture toys, starting with really legitimately starting with Star Wars in 78, 79, marching forward. And you have all of those brands for our generation moving into the Transformers, G.I. Joe, Star Wars,
that kind of stuff.
Star Wars, Power
Planet
Rangers.
of the Apes apparently was pretty big like that.
Well, that was all.
Bionic Man.
all the late 70s. You go into
Yeah.
those toys, and then it's the same thing. My father probably looks at my generation and goes, "Oh, there probably is a little bit of interest there in crossover, but in general, it's still not his stuff."
Yeah, but I could see the cross kind of being like, oh, your toys are made out of die cast as well, giving you the history of that.
There still is an appreciation, especially when you're a Transformer collector and your father's a die-cast collector. There's definitely crossover with 84, 85 toys. You know what I mean? Where it's made with die-cast and they're based on real cars. But then you jump another generation, and now you look at the kids who are like 5, 6, 7 years old, and all they do is on their iPad.
iPad or
and their
video
iPhone.
games.
And video games specifically, and they have little to no interest in toys. And again, it's not so much, like our thing is better than your thing, or kids today don't play with toys. It's just an evolution of play. And that has been going on already for 80 years. And who knows what the next thing is going to be. I always say the joke that those kids who are playing on the iPads and on the iPhones, their kids are going to be like in some VR kind of environment like Star Trek, like a holodeck. And they're going to be like, oh, remember my dad when he used to like sit on his device? What a loser. I use my hands,
Oh, I heard my grandfather, he picked up like a thing called a controller.
Yeah, like
Whoa.
He doesn't walk into a holodeck and just, appears in the Bahamas like it's nothing.
It's going to be like, there's videos out now where parents are showing their kids rotary phones and are asking them, try to use the rotary phone, and they just don't understand.
Of course. Well,
they just don't get it. They're like, I don't understand how this works.
In the same way that maybe not so much an 80s kid, but I'm pretty sure a 90s kid, if you showed him a record player without context and said, make this work, they wouldn't really, without scratching it.
I don't think it'll be that crazy. Maybe a smaller, or maybe an A-track.
Well,
I could see an A-track being like, I'm not, like, I kind of get it, but what? Why is this thing so huge?
It's something that sooner or later there's a cultural disconnect from something that's supposed to be so regular.
Because I know records are kind of making a big comeback.
Oh yeah, now especially, yeah.
Maybe a cassette. I think a cassette player. That definitely, because the way we have to do, Hasbro has to do Soundwave and Blaster. They kind of have to like explain to people, okay, well, a cassette is this and it does that and blah blah blah, or they just make them like have discs instead.
Well, at one point I remember they wanted to do a Classics Ravage that came with Hound, and on the back of the packaging they called Classics Ravage's alt mode deployer mode, because they didn't even know they didn't want to put cassette, because they were almost like, well, what is that going to be to people? We're knee deep in the Blu-ray market at the time. I think it was like 2010, 2011. So it's just, why would we do that? But the point is that there is an evolution of that, and I feel that as time progresses, Transformers will take a hit. But the one thing I have to say with Transformers is that they've always changed to kind of match what the market is, and the way that Hasbro has been changing things too. How I see it is, when I'm an old man, Transformers will still exist, but it'll be an IP of video games. It'll be an IP of that holodeck. There'll
be something to it.
There'll be some kind of evolution of play. It's, Hasbro started as a toy company and maybe evolve one day in the same way Nintendo evolved. Nintendo was a toy company in the 1902s, and then started doing video games and coin slots.
Toy company or card company?
Card and toy. Oh, okay. And then at one point
playing cards in there.
One time a love hotel company too. Whatever made money. So it's the same thing, that you could see that on a long-term spectrum, that if toys really doesn't become something that makes money in the big picture, I don't think Transformers will ever 100% stop being toys, unless it becomes like, I guess, impossible to make product, like, I guess, environmental wise or material wise. But it's something that there'll always be something that's a 3D tangible object that transforms from one thing to another. But I think there'll just be more of a decline to it. We won't have the, You know, like the ironic thing is, like, when Beast Wars came out, do you know how many figures came out in 1995? Like 14? 14 figures, maybe 16, you know? So like, and now it's like each year there's like easily 160 toys that came out.
Yeah.
So it's something that I could see us maybe dialing back to that early era of less product coming out, but maybe more cell phone games, and maybe it won't even be cell phone games, whatever it'll be, you know, 50 years from now, you know, it'll be that kind of digital product, which in a lot of ways I feel is all, if there's one brand that's best suited for that, I think it's Transformers. As technology gets more interesting in digital, Transformers will be the one that'll make that transition almost comfortably, in my mind, instead of, say, like, I don't know, Star Wars or something like that. Like the whole robotic digital world and digital entities, I could see, like, you know, they could literally change the brand that Transformers are digital, you know, creatures, if anything, like almost like a Digimon thing, or Pokemon could be too. So the brand will always change, it'll always survive, but it will take a hit, it will shrink as the world keeps moving forward. And I always believe that, you know, whatever is that age demographic of 25 to 35 is always the hottest products at the time, and as time progresses, that's going to be someone else's childhood, and then that'll get the main focus. In the same way that, you know, where's our Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers fans today, you know, or the Phantom, or, like, you know, I'm trying to think of like all those, like, at one point were very important properties, or Dick Tracy, you know, like,
oh man,
well, that's what I'm trying to say. Properties that were huge for people who were kids in the 40s and the 50s, and when it was the 90s, all had some kind of revivals, because now those kids of the 40s and the 50s were in that 25 to 35 to 40s demographic in the 90s, and they tried those revivals, didn't really catch, and, you know, that's all she wrote.
I think the only revival I really, really liked, I think I liked the Shadow revival, that movie with Alec Baldwin. I dug a lot because, like, just the style of it, and the French Flash Gordon cartoon I really liked a lot. I thought that was really,
and again,
really cool.
Those were all noble attempts at trying to modernize that kind of stuff, but it's the same thing. Just like we're saying, oh, you know, takes that hit because they're in the nursing homes. Quite a reality, like a sound reality, which might happen to us. And it's not to sound negative, but it's just, like I said, the evolution of play. As time progresses, you have to pass the baton to whatever is going to be the next thing, even if it took 60 years to finally overthrow us, you know, and then you just got to accept it. It's how it is. Nothing is forever, and that includes Transformers.